This is what I spend most of my days thinking about. This is a gharial. And as you can see, they're kind of like a crocodile or an alligator, and they live in rivers. And this is an adult female with her babies on her head. Kind of the main question is, what exactly is a gharial? You can see it does look a lot like a croc or an alligator, but it's got this really long, thin nose going on. And that's because it's a crocodilian. And the crocodilian is the overall family that includes the crocodiles, the alligators and caimans, and also the gharial. So this is a closely related group of animals, maybe like primates. So like we're related to orangutans and gorillas, but we're not exactly the same. And in the same way, we've got the gharial are in fact this really unique group of animals that are related to their more famous cousins. And there are currently thought to be 26 different species of crocodilian, and you get them all over the world, in pretty much every continent except for Antarctica and Europe. So that sucks for me right now because I'm currently in Europe and we don't have many crocs here. Now, the Guriel is a kind of group that contains two closely related species. And these are the Tomistoma and the Gharial. And I'm very lucky because I've got to see both in the wild. The Tomistoma, this little one here, although they can get to 5 meters, are found in Southeast Asia, whereas the Gharial, which is what I mostly work on, are found in India and Nepal. If you were wondering, yes, I am wearing my pajamas in this photo. I'd gone to bed when one of the team I was with found this little guy outside and so delivered it to me in bed. So this was the most exciting thing that I've ever found in my pajamas. But today I'm going to mostly be talking to you about the Gharial. Now you can see quite clearly here how different a Gharial is from a croc, with them conveniently lying here together. And you can see this is a mugger croc that you also find in Nepal. And they've got this really short, sort of compact head, whereas this Gharial has this beautiful slender snout, which can move much more quickly through the water when they're catching their prey. And as she's swimming through the water here, you can see just how well adapted they are for life underwater. They're the most aquatic crocs. They spend most of their time in the river. And you can see here she's got a really streamlined body and this big, powerful tail for propelling herself through the water. And they also actually have these big webbed feet, and these can help direct them when they're moving slowly in the water. And now the reason they've got this really long, thin snout, as I just mentioned, is so they can move quickly through the water. And that's because they mostly eat fish. So it's important to be able to move their head quickly to catch those fish underwater. Although they don't strictly always eat fish. You can see this male at the top is about to crunch down on a very unlucky turtle. But for the most part, they eat fish and other aquatic creatures. So maybe turtles or crabs or frogs, something like that. And that actually, they never attack people. So they're not a threat to people, which is great. You may be wondering what's wrong with this male here, why he's got this strange lump on the end of his nose. And that lump is in fact found on the end of the nose of all adult male Gharial. And it's called a gara, which is a word that means like a small clay pot, because it looks a bit like a clay pot. And that's what the Gharial's named after, the Gharial, because they've got this lump on the end of their nose. And for a long time, zoologists kind of wondered what it was all about. You can see it a bit closer here. They grow bigger and bigger as the male gets older and older until this lovely boy has this huge one. And this is my friend Jai, who's been doing research on Guriel communication. And he reckons that this is to do with communicating with other Gharial. So hopefully this noise is going to work. So that's the noise that only adult male Gharials can make. And if they don't have this gara on the end of the nose, they can't make that noise. And it's called a pop. And the pop noise is really important for communicating with other males to kind of tell them to keep off his patch when he's defending his ladies. He also uses it for flirting with female Gharial and also for communicating with his babies. So being able to make this pop noise is really important. And that's probably the primary role of this weird lump, the gara. Now, Gharial get really, really big. So you can see this adult male here. And in fact, adult males can get over 6 meters long. That's absolutely massive. Um, you can see one of his newly hatched babies here. So when they hatch, they're about as long as this yellow stick. So they got a long way to grow before they're going to be a big adult. In fact, even females have to be 3 meters long or more before they'll start to breed. Now, my favorite thing about Guriel is that they are absolutely fantastic parents. So this is an adult male here with lots and lots of probably his babies on the back. And so a dominant male and also dominant females and a couple of other females will guard the babies from all the females in an area who lay their nests all together with one another. The babies hatch out at the same time, and a couple of key adults then protect them, which is just absolutely amazing. But what's incredibly cool is the team that Jai's a part of in India, the Gharial Ecology Project. They've discovered that the male who does the looking after isn't always dad. In fact, he might be a sort of stepdad who steps in and looks after all the babies. And this is called Aloe Parenting. And it's really cool. And they're investigating it to try and find out more about why this might be. They think potentially that if males show females that they're really good parents, they have a better chance of being allowed to mate with her in the future. Because in Gharial, it's all about female choice. The males spend their whole time trying to look really big and really sexy and really tough in front of the females so that she'll choose to mate with them. And here up close are some little baby Gharial. And you can just see in this guy here how well adapted they are. You can see their big webbed feet, which I just absolutely love. So yeah, they're these little teeny tiny guys when they're born, just eating bugs and little shrimp, and they grow up to be these absolutely huge crocs. Kind of one thing that I always used to ask people when I was younger was, how did you end up where you are? So how did I end up as a croc scientist? And for me, working with reptiles is something I've always wanted to do. So my mum was going through the house the other day and turned up these photos, which show how little I've changed. Here I am, and here I am again, getting very excited about reptiles. And in fact, the ironic thing was, these are 2 pictures taken 20 years apart at exactly the same place, because if there's anything to do with reptiles, that's where I'm always going to be. And so my route, I kind of started off at school. I took all the subjects that were related to wildlife and conservation, like biology and geography. And then in my holidays from school, I was really lucky that there was a local zoo, and they gave me a place as a volunteer. So this was my first task with animals. Mostly it was actually picking up poo, but very occasionally I got to do the fun tasks like feeding the penguins. I then went on to do biology at university, then got a research internship, and then went on to do a master's, and again got to volunteer on my weekends at London Zoo, here with the tortoises, which was my first chance to really work with reptiles. And that's where I started to design my project working with Gharial. However, my other big love are flying foxes, so really giant fruit bats. So for a while, I was lucky enough to do research on them before I did another internship. It's kind of been a little bit of a long process, but then I luckily got my place doing a PhD and was able to set up this project working with crocs, and that's what I've been doing ever since. These are the organizations I work with at the moment, so a big thank you to all of them for supporting me. And here's, one of the little mugger crocodiles that I mentioned earlier that hatched out on our field site. So why work with Gharial? And the reason that we need to do research on Gharial is that they are critically endangered, which means they're at imminent risk of going extinct, and we wouldn't find them anywhere in the wild anymore. And we know this because since about the 1940s and 1950s, Gharial populations have declined by about 96%. So there's only about 4% of the number of Gharial who should be around today still alive. So they've really, really collapsed in the last sort of 50 to 70 years. And this is a huge, huge problem. And without knowing exactly why this is and how we can help the numbers increase again, they remain in this critically endangered category, which means they're still at risk of just slipping away and no longer existing on the planet. And the main reason for that is the building of dams and barrages on rivers. So these are a huge problem for pretty much all freshwater wildlife, including river dolphins, big fish and turtles, migratory fish, because they just break up the river into these little pieces, and each individual section of river is not necessarily big enough to support populations, including of gharial. And also they can individuals can sweep downstream over these dams, but can't necessarily get back. And for a species like the Gharial that can move over 200 kilometers up and down a river in a year, that's a really big problem. Another threat is getting accidentally caught in fishing nets. So very sadly, when Gharial get tangled in plastic fishing nets, they either drown or sometimes they get killed by the fishermen who are frightened of them. And the rivers I work in, I was once with a patrol with one of the wardens, and they confiscated this many fishing nets in an hour. So that shows how big the scale of the problem can be. And a new and emerging threat is people digging up the sand and gravel around rivers. And this is for use in construction work. So river sand is very good for building concrete and glass and the other important things in building cities. So there's a huge, huge demand for this resource. But the Gharial really, really need those sandbanks to lay their eggs in and to bask on. And so as these banks are being taken away, there's less and less habitat left for the Gharial. Now, where I work on Gharial is up here in Nepal. Gharial historically occurred pretty much over this whole map, so from Pakistan through northern India into Bangladesh, Myanmar and Bhutan. But they're now just left in 14 isolated populations in northern India and 2 populations in Nepal. And one of the big questions I wanted to answer, that the Nepal government were keen for me to answer, was how much river do we need to protect in order to save Gharial? And we've got a bit of a problem with studying Gharial. And that's if I'm coming along and I see 2 Gharial in the river and one disappears and then another one reappears, is this 3 Gharial or is this 2 different Gharial? And the third one is in fact also there under the water. And it's really hard to know because they do look really similar. Now, another problem we have is if we see a Gharial in the downstream part of the river and it swims upstream through the river, it's really hard to know how much of the river that individual Gharial needs for its life cycle. Is the Gharial swimming, 100 kilometers upriver and downriver in a year, or are they staying in these really small areas of river? So in order to investigate this, what we did is we caught some wild Gharial. We put tracking devices on their tails, and we then re-release them back into the river. And this enables us to answer some really key questions about how much of the river the Gharial are using, and also to tell apart these individual Gharials, enabling us to ask these individual level questions. Of course, to do that, I had to work with my absolutely amazing team. So here are 4 of my team members who have taught me so much. They're all from the indigenous Bote and Marji communities in Chitwan. And these guys know so much more about Gharial and the rivers in Chitwan than absolutely anyone else. So we teamed up and we caught some Gharial in the wild. And here we have the kind of action shot. Iteram up here has set a long net around the basking beach. Then the Gharial has come off this beach, gone into the water, and in theory, she then gets tangled in the net. Som and Kale here then have big throw nets that they throw over the top of her. We really quickly take her out and onto the shore where we can secure her. However, this was a big adult female, and she had survived this long by being really good at not getting caught in fishing nets. So she knew what we were all about. And the second she spotted this net here, she swam straight over the top of it, took one look at the guys here with the throw nets and went straight down to the bottom of the river. So we actually didn't manage to catch her at all. But we did manage to catch 20 other Gharial. So once we got them to the shoreline, we quickly untangled them from the nets. Then we apply pressure by sitting on them. That's the kind of safest and easiest way to keep them held down. We blindfold them, and this keeps them really calm and docile. Once they've got that bag over their eyes, they really, really calm down and don't really struggle anymore. And then we would then attach, we sort of stick to the top of the tail these tracking devices that allow us to follow up each individual Gharial. Then the whole procedure is usually less than half an hour. We take some key measurements, and here we are releasing the Gharial back into the river. So the way we do this is we completely untie them. We all get well out the way because even though they don't attack people, they have very sharp teeth. And the second the Gharial, we pull off the blindfold from a distance, and the second the Gharial sees the water, goes straight back in. So here we have one of the females just about to dive straight back into the river. And this then allows us to follow up. So we have this receiver, which is here, and each tracker releases its own particular sound, so we know which individual crocodile it's on. And we can then go up and down the river, locating exactly which Gharial is where. And if it moves, we can then pick up the signal from a different location, and we know that that same Gharial has moved across somewhere else. Similarly, we're able to track the Gharial as they're moving up or down river. So over a number of days or weeks, we go up and down all the rivers looking for signal, and we'll pick up the signal from a different direction if the Gharial has moved where it is, which is a lot of hours out going up and down the river, but that's great, as it means we can also pick up on lots of other things that are going on in the river, including fishing threats and other species. This is what it kind of looks like in person. This is me and my friend Ranjana tracking off a bridge, because the higher you are above the river, the better you can pick up the signal. And here's my awesome research assistant, Prakash, who this year, when I haven't been able to go to Nepal, has been leading all the tracking himself and with his team. And here they are going down in one of the huge rivers near the Indian border, checking out for some Gharial. And in fact, he's there today, almost exactly where this photo was taken, picking up the Gharial. And we found they use really big amounts of the river. This was an adult female. We caught her up here. She swam about 40 kilometers downstream to breed with an adult male down here, lay her eggs, looked after her babies for a month or so, and then she swam all the way back upriver to spend the monsoon or the rainy season in this small river again, fishing, because there's a lot of fish here. So they're using really big stretches of the river. And we find it's the adult females that seem to move a lot more. And here I am with, this is the whole catch team, with our biggest adult female. She was 4 meters long. Here we are having caught her, and then we restrain her with these ropes just to keep both the Gharial and ourselves safe. But you can see here just how absolutely giant she is. She's a really huge girl, and the males can get 2 meters longer than this. And after we put the tracking device on her back in the river, we were delighted to see this summer, here she is being the chief female, looking after all the babies of all the females in this section of the river. And we monitor what's happening with these adult females and males and the babies by using these remote cameras. So we set up the cameras on the riverbank. Here you can see the hatched eggs. The babies are just underwater here. And these enable us to watch what's going on with the babies 24 hours a day and to understand whether they're surviving in order to eventually grow up and join the population, whether they're struggling due to some other threats, either natural threats like predation by other species or unnatural threats like flooding when a dam is closed. And we were really excited to see a lot of baby Gharial hatching in Nepal, both last year and this year. And even if only 4 or 5% of these babies survive till adulthood, which is probably a reasonable number to naturally survive, that's going to make a real difference to the population. And so we like to refer to Gharial as these wonder mums and super dads, because they do such a good job of looking after their babies in these first few months after they hatch. This video from the Gharial Ecology Project in India shows the storks. So they like to eat baby gharial. And this is an adult female. So this is mum just having none of it. And they'll see off birds and other predators like this. But what's really interesting is where I am in Nepal, we also get a lot of other bigger threats, including this tiger, which showed up and was walking upriver. And you can see this female here is responding to the tiger defensively. So her babies are all in the water here, and she's following that tiger along, watching where he is, defensively making herself visible to the tiger. So these really are wonder mums. They're not frightened. They're going to take on anything that might threaten their babies. And this is a wonderful picture taken from a drone down in India, where they have a much bigger recovering population of gharial. And you can see here this adult male and the huge number of babies that have hatched out after they were laid in this big sandbank. And they're all being looked after by this male. And this is Gharial expert Pankaj Kumar, who's making observations of this male's behavior. And this is kind of a dream goal for all Gharial conservationists, that Gharial populations can recover to the level where all males get to look after this many babies every year. I want to say a huge thank you to all my project partners. This is a collaborative effort. I'm just one person, part of a big team based out in Nepal, every person of which makes this possible, doing this research. And a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with funding. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. I'm very excited to answer any questions.
All right, Phoebe, that was awesome. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I love those pictures. I love the videos. And it was great to meet those super moms and super dads. So thanks for sharing that with us today. Very cool. All right, well, let's meet some classrooms. So those groups who are tuning in live via YouTube, now's the time. If you have a few questions, you can send them in via the chat, and I'll keep my eye out for them. But let's take a little trip and start visiting some of our live groups. So let's see, let's start today. Let's go to our group in Chalk River, Ontario. So grade 6, 7, and 8s look like, with Mrs. Shattuck hanging out with us. Let's bring them into the call. There we go. How are we doing?
How long do they live for?
Oh, that's a really good question. And we don't actually know the answer. So we think they can live a pretty long time. It's probably reasonable to think they can live well over 60 or 70 years. But it's really hard to actually measure how long any croc lives in the wild. And in captivity, we either haven't been keeping crocs for long enough in captivity to know what their kind of maximum lifespan is, especially because crocs that are pretty old today, when we were first keeping them in captivity, we didn't know all that much about how to keep them healthy. So they can probably live longer than we think. It's probably not unreasonable to think that the odd gharial might be able to live up to 100, kind of like a really old person might live that long. But we suspect that because the gharial alive today only get up to about 6 meters, and they only started recovering back in the 80s. So these guys are probably only 40, 50 years old. And there are old reports of gharial getting to 8 meters. And so we think if they keep going really slowly throughout their lives, then potentially you could get the occasional massive croc that's really, really old. But we don't really know exactly.
All right, let's bring in our crew from New Jersey, Mrs. Edelson's class.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Hey, New Jersey, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome, how you doing?
Good, good. Sophia, you want to come ask your question? Sophia's going to ask a question.
All right.
How do you know it's a girl or a boy?
Oh, really good question. So that's one of the really important things. And unlike humans, with gharial, all their kind of bits about whether they're a girl or a boy, or where their waist comes out, is all in one kind of orifice called the cloaca, which is on the underside of the belly. And what you have to do is, it sounds a little bit gross, you very gently put your fingers inside that, having cleaned them, you gently put them inside, and you have to feel whether it has a penis or not. But it's actually pretty hard to tell, because a lot of the females also can have something that feels a little bit like a penis. So it's about 70% of the time you're really confident, but about 30% of them it's just really hard to tell. But with the big adults, it's much easier, because the males have that big lump on their nose, and that's a dead giveaway. And in the little babies, we don't know how to tell. No one, until they're about 1 meter long, it's impossible to know if they're a boy or a girl. So we have to wait.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to grab a question from online here. Ms. Dykstra's class is joining us, and they're wondering two things. You said they eat fish, so are they dangerous to swim with? And then they're wondering how big that bump on the nose can get.
Okay, so are they dangerous to swim with? No. I wouldn't worry about it. I've waded and swum in the rivers when we've been doing other things, and I'm not worried about the Gharial at all. I definitely would not approach one, because they can be very defensive. So if they're frightened, they might try and protect themselves by hitting you with their snout. But because their teeth are really sharp and they kind of stick out the sides, if they give you a sideways swipe, that can be really, really painful, actually quite dangerous. So definitely not worth going near them, but they don't pose a threat to people, and they would never attack a person. And then I've forgotten the second question, sorry.
That's okay. The bump on the end of their snout, they were wondering how big that can get.
Okay. Really, really big. So it starts off when the male gets to about 4 meters. It starts growing as this little tiny thing that eventually gets kind of fist-sized. In a big adult male who got to 6 meters, you might be talking something this size, because their snout, even though it's kind of proportionally very thin, it gets to about this thick because they're so long. So this big gara sits on the end. Maybe that perspective is making it a bit too big, but yeah, really, really sizable. So we've got one adult male in captivity in Chitwan at this breeding center, and he's got one that's really, really sizable. So yeah, very big, and they're kind of made of cartilage, kind of like this bit of your nose. So they're kind of weird and soft.
All right, very cool. So I can see our group in Toronto, Ontario. Mr. Deslaurier's group looks like they're typing in a few questions for us, but I'm going to bring them in and see if they want to ask one or two of them live. So I'll bring them in live. Hey, Toronto.
I don't know if you can hear us.
We gotcha. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, thank you so much. We had a few questions. We had the audio problem earlier. We were wondering, have you ever been bit by one of the Gharials?
Good question. Yes, I have. I only got bit by a little one. He was only about 1.5 meters long. And it wasn't so much a bite. It was, I mishandled him and gave me a little bit of a bash in the chest to warn me. But one of the teeth went straight in. I don't know, you can see it, but there's the scar from where the tooth got me. So I learnt my lesson and have avoided being bit ever since.
Thanks. We have just one more question, maybe, or two.
Yeah, go for it.
How many eggs can a female Gharial lay?
Oh, great question. So it kind of depends on the size of the female Gharial. So the bigger and bigger they get, the more and more eggs they lay. It's kind of an average, maybe about 40 eggs once they get to quite a big size. So they can lay a lot, and they're actually one of the biggest of all croc eggs. So the Guriel and the Tomistoma, their relative, they have the biggest eggs of any croc. So they're a really sort of sizable egg, much bigger than something like a chicken egg.
All right. Well, we're going to swing back your way shortly, but I want to go to Ms. Langer's virtual group hanging out with us in Peterborough. How are you doing today, Ms. Langer?
Good, thank you. So my students from the Cobourg-Peterborough area in Ontario are wondering, despite that the Gharial is such an amazing parent, I think this is fascinating. We're also wondering if there is a program to hand raise any of these babies in order to increase the population and then reintroduce them to the wild.
Awesome question. That is basically most of the subject of my PhD, actually. So that's the kind of the question I came in asking. And yes, that has been the basis of the whole Gharial conservation program in Nepal and India since the late 70s, is they collect in the eggs from the wild. They then rear them up in captivity until they're about 1.5 meters long and re-release them back into the wild. And that's the whole reason the Gharial didn't go extinct in the 80s, is because of these programs that kept it going. But my big question in my PhD is then, even though this has been happening, and at the site where I work, they've released well over 1,200 Gharial into the river, the population's still really small. So there's less than 200 Gharial left, even though they've released, 1,400 or so Gharial into the river. So something happens to them after they're released. And we've started to find out, and it seems to be a lot of them die after they're being released. A lot of them get small Gharial tend to stay in a smaller area of river, but these guys that are released from captivity, they don't seem to have that ability to stay in one place, or they're confused by the release, and so they can end up really, really far downstream. So there is a really big program collecting in eggs from the wild and releasing them back, but it doesn't seem to work as well as we might hope. So there's been a big shift in the last kind of 5 or 6 years towards leaving more nests in the wild and protecting them in their habitats in the rivers, because then the ones raised in captivity can be a kind of additional help to the population, but it seems like protecting them and letting the nests hatch in the wild is probably the best way to have a healthy population.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Mrs. Green. Her class is joining her virtually as well from Toronto. Let's get in here. Hey, Miss Green. Oh, Miss Green, can you unmute for me?
You'd think after teaching virtually for all these months, I'd have that unmute thing down. My kids are wondering, Sophia is wondering, do male Gharials fight other male Gharials for females? And Daoud is wondering, how many teeth do they have altogether?
Oh, okay. I'll answer the teeth one first. So they have about 111 teeth. They have a lot of teeth. So yeah, they have about 111 teeth, and they continually replace them throughout their lives. So as each tooth falls out, there's another one ready to come up and replace it. And oh yes, male Gharial definitely fight each other. So in the lead up to the breeding season, the males want to defend particular areas that the females have congregated in. And the males want to hold on to that area so that they have the chance to flirt with and hopefully mate with as many females as possible. But other males are going to turn up and try and take over that dominant male spot. And they really, really fight. So firstly, they might kind of do some sort of face-offs. And if it's very obvious that one is much bigger, so much longer, got a much bigger gara, the smaller one tends to head on. But if they're fairly well matched, or if the small ones are really, really aggressive, tough little guy, then they start these contests where they're trying to push the other one underwater. So this involves a lot of making this pop noise. So they pop at each other and they hiss at each other. It's really, really noisy. They swim up to each other and make this big wave, and then they surf on top of it and kind of body slam the other Gharial. And then if that doesn't work, they are trying to push one, pushes the other down. So it kind of looks like they're fencing, because they end up sort of smashing their jaws together as they try to push the other one under. And those sharp teeth kind of rake all the way down the other Gharial. So they pull each other's skin off. They look really worse for wear after they fought. And sometimes they'll fight for hours. If they're well matched, they will fight for a really long time. So yeah, they really do fight during the breeding season. And then at other times of year, they're much more tolerant and they don't tend to get into conflicts in the same way.
All right, sounds pretty intense. Okay, I'm going to grab a couple questions from YouTube. One is from Alora, and she's curious about, you mentioned India and Nepal. Are there other places to find Gharial? And then Akash is joining us from India, and he's curious about their memory. So, remembering parts of the river or other individuals they've interacted with.
Yeah, so the first question, they are just in India and Nepal now. The occasional one sometimes turns up in Bangladesh when they've been swimming or washed downstream. They used to be in many more places. They used to be in more rivers in India. They used to be possibly in Myanmar and definitely in Pakistan and Bhutan. But sadly, they've all gone extinct there. They've gone extinct in a number of other rivers in India and Nepal. And there are a couple of key places where they're holding on. So the only big and really healthy gharial population is in somewhere called the National Chambal Sanctuary in India. All the other populations, including mine, are just these sort of teeny tiny remnants that are hopefully starting to recover. And in terms of gharial memory, that's very cool. I've never had a question like that before. They're really smart. All crocs are very clever, but Gharial are equally smart. So they can be in zoo collections. They're trained to do all sorts of things, kind of like dogs. You can train them to remember to come to a particular colored cone when they need to be fed. You can train them to, come if there's a whistle or some other kind of stimulus. And they can remember this for a really long time. So they definitely have a very, very good memory. I'd say pretty confidently, I'd definitely say most crocs are as smart as something like a dog. They're just reptiles, so they tend to do everything on a much slower and more intermittent basis. In terms of remembering places in the river, we're not really certain how crocs navigate, but saltwater crocodiles that have been translocated really big distances across Australia find them the whole way home. So maybe they're navigating with something like some like magnetic sense. They possibly remember landmarks in the river. One thing we found quite interesting was for the few months after we caught and tagged the Gharial, if they heard my voice, so the voice of the person who'd been there when they were tagged, for like a month or two afterwards, they would definitely respond. Like other people would be talking, there'd be nothing, I'd say something and they'd have a look at me. And so they definitely were remembering some sort of association. So yeah, there's definitely a lot more to be done on how smart crocs are. A lot more stuff's been done on alligators, but definitely whole avenues for research there.
All right, very cool. Well, as you can tell, there's tons and tons of questions. Our students are definitely very interested in what you get to study. So camera classrooms, give me a wave if I should come back to your classroom. You can visit a few more classrooms and get a couple more questions in. So give me a wave if you want me to come back. All right, let's get started. Let's start off in New Jersey.
Hi, we have a question from one of our online friends. Aaron wants to know how you put the tracking tag on them.
Yeah, so if you saw from the photos, there are like these kind of sticky up scales on the tail. And we kind of pierce them, I guess, a bit like an ear piercing. And we pierce through those scales. And then we use a really strong bit of string to then wedge it down so that that's going through the scale and is holding the tracker on really tightly to the tail. And that then heals up. And that stays in place for 2 years, maybe a bit longer, till eventually that string kind of gets broken away on rocks and the whole thing falls off. So it hurts a little bit, but it's a really secure and safe way of putting it on. People tried before things like harnesses, but that's unfortunately quite dangerous on a croc because you didn't want anything that could get tangled underwater and hold the animal under. So this securing it, sort of tying it onto the tail seems to be the safest way of putting them on.
All right, great question. Statics group.
Are they related to garpikes at all? Because the big long mouth.
Oh, I don't know what a garpike is.
Are you thinking of the garfish? Yeah.
Oh my, what you mean? Sorry. Yeah. So they're not related, but they've both evolved in a really similar environment in the river, and that really long snout has evolved a couple of different times. in some fish, also in river dolphins. They've evolved to have this really long snout that can move more quickly through the water, and that's an adaptation for catching fish. So there's quite a few different animals that have evolved this similar looking snout, and that's called convergent evolution. So when species that aren't actually related evolve to look quite similar because they're doing a similar thing and living in a similar environment, we call it convergent evolution. And my favorite one is the river dolphin. We have one left where I work in Nepal, the last river dolphin before they sadly go extinct there. But they've similarly got this really long, thin snout because they move their head quickly through the water to catch fish.
All right, Mrs. Langer.
We are currently studying animals and habitat and the food chain. And so my students are wondering, where on the food chain would you say the Gharial is? And would you say it's a producer or a consumer or both? So you can see where their language is coming from.
Absolutely. Oh, awesome question. So they're a consumer. So they're totally carnivorous, which when they're little, they eat other small creatures that you find in the river, so little fish, little bugs. And as they get bigger and bigger, they move right up to the top of that food chain until they're eating these big fish and big turtles and things you find in the river. Especially a big adult males, pretty much nothing is going to eat him. Whereas when they're little, as well as being a carnivore and a consumer, they're also kind of at the bottom of the food chain because everything eats baby Gharial, everything. Big fish, other crocodiles, loads of different types of birds, jackals, pigs, you name it, it eats baby Gharial. And the bigger and bigger they get, the safer and safer they are, until eventually absolutely nothing eats them. But because they never shift to eating big things themselves, they're not kind of at the top of the food chain in the way that maybe a big mugger crocodile or saltwater crocodile might be. So they kind of fill an interesting position.
All right, Miss Green, do you have another question for us from your crew? No? Okay, that's okay. No worries. And we'll check in with our group in Toronto again, because I see a couple questions were typed for us.
Yeah, sorry, we had one more question. Have you ever seen an albino Gharial?
I have not, no. I've never seen an albino Gharial. I've seen albino alligators in captivity, so in zoos. I don't think an albino Gharial would live very long in the wild if one was born, just because it's really important for the baby Gharial to be really well camouflaged. So they're kind of green and stripy, which helps them blend in really well. Whereas if they were very light colored, they'd probably get picked off by a bird pretty quickly.
Okay, and I've got a great question here to wrap things up from the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station. And they're curious if, similar to turtles and some other crocodile species, if they're the gender can be determined by the temperature, if it's temperature dependent.
Yes, absolutely. So all crocs have this temperature dependent sex determination. So the temperature of the egg determines whether they end up being male or female. This is really tricky to study in Gharial. As we discussed earlier, you can only tell whether they're male or female when they get to about 1 meter long. So it's a really long-term study if you're going to try and look at this. But it has been studied at somewhere called the Madras Crocodile Bank by Jeff Lang. And they found that there's something going on we don't quite understand. Possibly, like in some other crocs, it's the gradual increase in temperature peaking at a potential different temperature for male and female leads to that, or whether there's something even slightly more confusing going on. We're not sure, but it's definitely really, really important. And in other crocs, it's much more cut and dry. There's a very particular temperature, and if you put the eggs at that temperature, you're going to get males, you're going to get females. So it's definitely partially true in Gharial, but it's really tricky to study what exactly those temperatures are.
All right. And Miss Green's class is swooping in. They have one more question.
Sorry, one of my students has one more question. She's wondering, did gharials and alligators eat the same things, even though they live in different parts of the world?
Yeah, awesome question. So they both, yes, to some extent, definitely. Alligators and Guriels are going to predominantly eat fish and other things that they find in the river. The major difference between Guriels and alligators would be, as well as eating, fish or turtles or crabs, alligators have a broader diet because they will also grab land-based animals and pull them into the water. So they might also eat kind of mammals, with all other crocs and things. You kind of think of those famous videos of crocodiles in Africa eating like zebra or wildebeest. So big crocs and alligators will grab these land-based animals and pull them in, and that makes this kind of broader diet. And similarly, the jaws of an alligator are much more powerful. They've got a much more powerful bite force. So they can eat much bigger animals and they can crunch on sort of tougher animals. Whereas the Gharial strictly only eat animals found in the river. We have some reports of them eating ducks, which is about as exciting as a Gharial gets, whereas an alligator is pretty relaxed. It'll eat basically anything.
All right. Well, I want to start off with a huge shout out to the crew who joined us on YouTube today. Thank you for sending in such great questions. To our camera classrooms, thank you for being with us today and your awesome questions. And Phoebe, thank you so much for joining us from the UK today and sharing the awesome work you get to do in Nepal.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation and for all the awesome questions. It's been great.
All right. So if classrooms wanted to follow your adventures, where could they go? Do you have some social media or?
I do. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Instagram is probably the most exciting, with at Crocodile Done PhD. I can put it in the chat. And I try and, especially when I'm in the field, keep a nice update of my science and the kind of day-to-day life of being a croc scientist.
All right, very cool. So Crocodile Done PhD. I like that. I'll pop that up there on the screen as well, just for any of the classrooms who are tuning in. Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much. Phoebe, it was great to have you joining us today. Again, thank you to all of our classrooms, and we hope to see you in some more events coming soon. Thanks, everyone.